Hi everybody, this is Greg Tiener for The Mindful Eye and the Daily Critique. Today's image was submitted by George, who is an intermediate photographer from Pennsylvania. George shot this with a Nikon F100. That's a camera you're not familiar with. It's a film camera. George shot this with a 24 to 120 zoom at 35 millimeters. The film he used was Fuji Velvia 50, and the 50 is the ISO of the film, and at f11 he exposed the file for 15 seconds. George has some backstory information and a question, but I want to hold off on talking about that and just get into the things I like about the image. One of the things I like about this image is the simplicity of it, and I also really enjoy the contrast in this image. I like high contrast images, and to me this image sort of has two levels of contrast that are very powerful. One is just sort of a global contrast that has quite a bit of information that's very low end, feels almost like pure black in the image on my screen, and then quite a bit of information that's very, very bright, pushing close to white. And it also has some really beautiful local contrast that gives the image in certain places a really powerful texture that almost feels etched or metallic. Really enjoy contrast here. The other thing that I really like a lot about this image is just the idea of juxtaposing one type of geometry with another. In this case, it's kind of the soft arcing lines juxtaposed with geometric shapes that are a lot more hard edged. You see that in both implied positive and negative space shapes in the water and also in the rocks that we're seeing in the image. It's a real basic design motif that you could think about as a takeaway from the critique today, just looking for these kinds of situations where we could juxtapose more of sort of a natural geometry with something that's sort of more hard-edged and man-made. You see this as a cinematic convention quite a bit too. Another thing that I really like about this image is color. We talk a lot about complementary color pairs here when we're referencing color design on the Daily Critique. There are other pairs of colors that can be very powerful too. One of those pairs of colors is the idea of black and yellow. When we see black and yellow in nature, it tends to be a warning sign, so it can be a very powerful pair of colors from a psychological impact standpoint, and I'm enjoying that here. I like the simplicity of this image, and I really like the way diagonals have been played in the image. There's a contouring line in terms of the movement of the water and the shape of the rocks here on this waterfall that totally implies the most powerful diagonal in an image, which is top left to bottom right. And then there's the implication of diagonal movement that crosshatches that. If you look at this negative space here in the lower shelf of rocks, and if you also look at the negative space that moves in between this area of high contrast and this area of high contrast, you have an implication of diagonal movement in the other direction. Diagonals are so powerful. That's because if we have a blank frame, we have the corners of the image that are very, very powerful points of energy. And when we connect those powerful points of energy, it helps to, at one time, potentially unify an image, but also create the feeling of being able to move through the photograph, which we know is just an illusion, but that feeling for the viewer to be able to get inside of the photograph in addition to moving side to side and up and down can really help the viewer to stay with what we're trying to say a lot longer. And the other thing I'd encourage you to think about in rectangularly framed images is not only major diagonal movement but also minor diagonals. What am I talking about? If you can imagine taking a line from a corner and going to the opposite side of the frame and implying energy that moves to a point that is about 2/3 of the way through that line. So in this case, that would be a minor diagonal going to the other side, and another one would be somewhere right in here. Looking at both of those types of diagonals in all kinds of ways, when we're framing, when we're considering subject placement, when we're looking at the energy in between powerful subjects, and also in our editing in terms of how we manage color and contrast. It's really important, if we're working traditionally, a lot of times to remember the power of diagonals in our designs. What's really interesting to me about this image is that George, in his backstory, mentions seeing the archetype of an animal in the potential of this frame, and that is why he in fact framed the shot and took the picture. under questions and comments, he says he was thinking about a black and white conversion, but he really liked the way colors give the image of the animal life, and I can't agree more with him. When you combine the archetype of the shape of this animal. What's an archetype? It's just a universal symbol that potentially everybody, all human beings everywhere, would recognize. A smile as an archetype. To me, the archetype of this animal is the archetype of a cat, and potentially a predatory cat, like a leopard or a puma. And for a lot of people, that might represent an extreme from a psychological standpoint, like the idea of fear connected to the idea of predator or maybe power. And we've already mentioned that the black and yellow color combination could, in a very intense way for the viewer of the image, combine with the archetype of that shape to have a big impact from a psychological standpoint. And so one of the big takeaways from the critique today could just be the idea of looking at the information when you're framing images, when you're choosing images from a shoot, looking at the information on this other level of reality, not just what it actually is. It's a rock or it's water, whatever the subject matter might actually be, but also looking for the implication of archetypes. To me, archetypes are very, very powerful when it comes to design. And the other thing that I wanted to mention today that I think is fascinating is just the look of this file and knowing that it is a slide that has been scanned. And I've talked about this quite a bit on the Daily Critique, but I'd really encourage you to look at the histogram on this image. And you can see that there are a lot of pixels that are being represented here that are very dark and very close to black, and there's a strong black point here as well. And I've mentioned quite a bit how with digital capture, one of the things that's happening, if we were to say that this whole image was the histogram, we had a histogram overlay, we're starting to sort of get pushed to think about staying inside of the lines and also creating these histograms that sort of look average. And it can make our files look very flat, particularly in a situation like this where the file has the potential to express a very strong black point. One of the things about slide film is if you were to go out and shoot with a film camera, say you'd never done it, and just shoot average scenes 3 or 4 days and expose for the highlights, and then scan all of those slides, so many of your slides would have a real strong area in the very low end in terms of a lot of pixels. And one of the things to remember is that having a real strong black point or an area of black that's very rich can really help to anchor the file, and it has a big effect on how all the other values and all the other colors read. It's a way to create a richness and to create both a visual depth and a psychological depth to your image. And so one of the things I'd really encourage you to think about from the video today is how you're managing black as an idea from a design standpoint. Something else that's totally fascinating to me is, having shot Velvia as a film for so long, one of the things I know about it on a very long exposure, like 15 seconds, is that the film Velvia would shift to green. And if you didn't want it to do that, then you would have to filter your image with some magenta. And I think that may be part of the reason why we're getting so much of a feeling of green in the water. What's interesting is, well, what do we do with digital? Well, we're always trying to sort of normalize everything. We come in with a white balance tool and get the green out, but it's the yellow sort of green here, to me, that's so powerful, connected to the idea of the archetype. One other thing that I'll say here that I think is an aspect of this being shot on film is the feeling of local texture, due to the fact that film, to create its detail, is using film grains to record the light, and so you get more of a sense of this really beautiful textured grain of the film. Even with a film like Velvia that is almost grainless, you still get a different sense of that. Those are 3 things that you could think about. Letting color shifts happen sometimes. How do you manage your blacks? How do you manage the low end of your file? And also the idea of texture, and maybe having a little bit of an aspect of noise, or even going in and adding noise. Just some things to consider. Really want to say a huge thank you to George for submitting this image. It's been so long since we've had a submission that is from film. Maybe there are more people out there that are shooting film that would like to submit to the Daily Critique. That would be great. Love to hear your feedback about the critique today, and want to say a big thank you to you for being here. Hope to see you again real soon on The Mindful Eye.